Shortly after the funeral of his wealthy wife, the husband and his mistress went to withdraw the inheritance money. Hours later, upon arriving at the bank, they encountered a great surprise they could never have imagined. The bell of St. Joseph Church echoed through the historic neighborhood of Montreal, while a fine mist spread over the cobblestone streets. It was a typical Canadian autumn day, with golden leaves gently falling from the trees and the fresh air filled with silence. Inside the church, Quebec's elite gathered in mourning, surrounded by colorful stained glass windows that cast a soft, solemn light over the faces of those present. The funeral of Madeleine Beauchamp, a woman respected and admired for her philanthropy and elegance, was an event worthy of her influence. Richard Beauchamp, the widower, was in the front row, his eyes fixed on the coffin. He appeared unperturbed, maintaining a stoic expression that many would interpret as a display of strength. But inside, Richard was torn. He couldn't concentrate on the religious service, his emotions swinging between guilt and relief. As the priest offered prayers in French, the predominant language in Quebec, Richard's mind wandered through a web of dark thoughts. Clara, Richard's mistress, was at the back of the church, dressed in black like everyone else, but away from curious eyes. She maintained a serious demeanor, though her focus was on something entirely different. Clara didn't know Madeleine. She was there for a specific reason, and while she listened to the echo of the priest's words, her thoughts were directed towards the future. The weeks leading up to Madeleine's death had been tense. Richard was on the brink of an emotional breakdown, caught between his marriage to Madeleine, which had long been a mere formality, and his affair with Clara, which he kept secret from Quebec's stringent social circles. Clara, younger and ambitious, had no patience for Richard's caution. She saw Madeleine's death as an opportunity to rise socially and finally live the luxurious life she had always dreamed of. The funeral ended with the soft sound of the organ filling the space. As the guests began to disperse, Richard slowly stood up, feeling the weight of their gazes. He shook hands with friends and acquaintances, accepting their condolences with a mask of grief. Clara, in turn, waited patiently, knowing it wasn't the time to approach. Her moment would come soon. As the guests left for the cold Montreal air, Richard spotted Clara in the distance. For a brief moment their eyes met, but he quickly looked away. He knew he couldn't raise any suspicions, at least not now. However, both knew what needed to be done next. Without saying a word, Richard walked to the waiting car. Minutes later, as the last cars left the church parking lot, Clara discreetly approached and got into the same vehicle. The driver, hired for the occasion, showed no surprise. They drove silently through the streets of Montreal, a city seemingly oblivious to the whirlwind of emotions filling the car. The drive to the bank was short, but to Richard and Clara, it felt like an eternity. Every corner, every red light brought with it an emotional weight that grew increasingly unbearable. Richard kept his eyes fixed on the road, while Clara gazed out the window, observing the city's historic facades. She knew Montreal, but now the city seemed different, closer to her goals. Inside the car, the silence was broken only by the gentle hum of the engine and the distant noise of traffic. Clara finally broke the silence, her voice low and controlled. "Are you sure everything is ready?" she asked, not taking her eyes off the window. Richard took a moment to respond. His heart was racing, and he felt a slight pressure in his chest. It wasn't just nervousness about what was to come, but the weight of his choices, his lies beginning to accumulate. "It's all set," he replied, with a tone firmer than he actually felt. He had checked the documents repeatedly, verified every detail of the inheritance, and was confident that the money would be transferred without complications. Clara said nothing more. She knew Richard was dealing with complicated feelings, but to her, that didn't matter. What mattered was the money, the future she could build with it. Madeleine's death was just an inevitable step. Finally, the car stopped in front of the bank. It was an old financial institution located in Montreal's historic district, an imposing building with marble columns and an air of formality that intimidated anyone who passed by. The bank represented tradition and stability, but for Richard and Clara, it represented the final point of a carefully orchestrated plan. As Richard got out of the car, he looked up at the grey sky. The cold air made him shiver, and for a moment he felt the weight of it all come crashing down on him. He knew that from this moment on, his life would never be the same. Toronto, with its bright lights and fast pace, seemed a world away from Quebec, where Richard spent most of his life. It was there, amid business meetings and social events, that he first met Clara. They were at a gala event, one of those charity nights intended to raise funds for organizations. Richard, always accompanied by Madeleine, had attended such events for years, but that night he was alone. Madeleine had stayed in Quebec, occupied with her own commitments. Richard had never been the type of man to seek out adventures. He was always discreet, reserved, and his marriage, though emotionally distant, was stable and secure. However, when he first saw Clara, something in him changed. She was young, full of life, and her eyes conveyed an ambition he recognized from his younger days. It was as if he saw in Clara a reflection of what he had long lost: passion, enthusiasm for something new and unknown. Clara, on the other hand, knew exactly what she was doing. She had grown up in a middle-class family in Toronto, far from the social circles of Canada's elite. Intelligent and astute, she used her beauty and charisma to get close to influential men, always on the lookout for opportunities. Richard was older, but he was exactly the kind of man she was looking for: wealthy, powerful, and vulnerable. The age difference between them didn't bother her. In fact, it was a detail she knew how to use to her advantage. That night, amid glasses of champagne and superficial conversations, Clara managed to get close to Richard. She used charm, showed interest in his business, and, most importantly, in his personal life. Richard, used to dealing with opportunistic people, was intrigued. Clara was different. She seemed genuine, interested not only in what he could offer financially, but in his company as well. At least, that's what he believed. After that night, things progressed quickly. Richard began to travel more to Toronto, under the pretense of business, but in reality, his meetings with Clara became the real reason for his trips. They met in discreet hotels and restaurants away from the city center, always out of sight from those who might recognize him. For Richard, Clara was an escape from the monotony of his marriage to Madeleine. Clara, in turn, saw in Richard a chance to finally enter the world she had longed for. As the affair intensified, Richard began to feel the weight of guilt. He knew cheating on Madeleine was wrong, but the spark between him and his wife had been extinguished for years. Their marriage was sustained by social conventions and a solid financial partnership. Madeleine, descended from one of Quebec's most traditional families, brought with her a considerable fortune, and Richard had benefited from it. Still, the affection between them no longer existed. Clara pressured Richard to make she no longer wanted to be the woman hidden in the background, living in secret forever. Richard, on the other hand, hesitated. Leaving Madeleine meant risking his social standing, his business, and, more importantly, his financial stability. Madeleine controlled a significant portion of the family fortune, and Richard knew that if they separated, he would lose a large part of it. The relationship between Richard and Clara grew increasingly tense. She wanted more time, more money, more He, torn between desire and reason, began to realize that the affair that had started as a fling was becoming something much larger and more dangerous. But then, everything changed when Madeleine was diagnosed with a sudden and fatal illness. The news of Madeleine's illness surprised everyone, including Clara. Richard, however, saw the tragedy as an opportunity. Though emotionally shaken, he knew that if Madeleine died, he would inherit a large portion of her fortune, which would resolve his pro. With this perspective in mind, he began to plan, ensuring that the will was in order and that the finances would be transferred to his name without complications. Clara, upon learning of the diagnosis, felt a mix of compassion and relief. She knew that with Madeleine's death, the path would be clear for her and Richard to live the life they had long planned. But at the same time, she began to notice the coldness with which Richard was handling the situation. To him, Madeleine's illness was an opportunity to solve his problems, and Clara realized she was dealing with a man willing to do whatever it took to achieve his goals. As Madeleine fought against the illness, Richard and Clara continued their meetings, now with more caution, knowing that the end was near. Richard began to prepare for the new phase of his life without Madeleine. Clara, in turn, started to dream about the wealth and status she would inherit alongside Richard. However, Madeleine was smarter than they both imagined. Although weakened, she noticed changes in Richard's behavior, and over the months of her illness, began to make her own plans. Without Richard knowing, she revised her will, with the help of her trusted lawyer, ensuring that her fortune would be allocated to something that reflected her values rather than her husband's selfish ambitions. When Madeleine finally passed away, Richard and Clara's plan seemed about to come to fruition. However, they were about to face a surprise that would change everything. The bank building in Montreal's historic district was imposing, with its marble columns and an air of solemnity that commanded respect. Richard and Clara walked through the large glass doors, accompanied by the muffled sound of their footsteps on the marble floor. The atmosphere inside the bank was calm, almost reverent, as if the very space demanded respectful behavior. Richard approached the main counter, where a clerk greeted them with a polite smile, unaware of the emotional turmoil unfolding between the couple. He presented his documents, ensuring that everything was in order for the withdrawal of Madeleine's inheritance. As they waited, the air in the bank felt dense, almost suffocating. Richard felt cold sweat trickle down his neck. Clara, meanwhile, maintained a controlled expression, though her eyes were fixed on the clock, counting every passing second. For her, this was the decisive moment. Minutes later, the bank manager, a middle-aged man with a serious demeanor, approached them. He greeted them politely, but his expression indicated something unusual. Richard frowned, disturbed by the man's formal and distant attitude. There was a tension in the air that did not fit with the simplicity of the task he was about to undertake. "Mr. Beauchamp," the manager began, adjusting his glasses on his nose, "there are some formalities we need to discuss regarding Mrs. Madeleine's inheritance." Richard, trying to hide his discomfort, nodded. "Of course, I'm aware of the formalities. We can proceed with the withdrawal, correct?" The manager hesitated for a moment, looking at the papers in his hands. He seemed to be weighing each word carefully, as if he were about to say something that would change the entire situation. "Unfortunately, Beauchamp, there has been a recent revision to Mrs. Madeleine's will. We need to discuss these changes before we can proceed with any transaction." These words were like a cold shower for Richard. He felt his body stiffen as he looked at Clara, who for the first time showed signs of nervousness. They both knew something was wrong, something they hadn't anticipated. "Revision," Richard repeated, trying to remain calm. "What are you talking about? I checked everything before Madeleine's death. The will was in order." The manager, still maintaining professional composure, adjusted the papers in his hands. "I understand, sir. However, Mrs. Madeleine made a final modification to her will shortly before she passed away. Her lawyer delivered the updated documents to the bank, and these changes directly affect the distribution of her inheritance." Richard felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. He was trying to process what he was hearing. How could this be possible? He had taken such care to ensure everything was in order, making sure nothing went wrong. And now, at the last moment, this unexpected modification was arising. Clara, on the other hand, looked at Richard, waiting for him to take action. She knew it depended on him to clarify the situation. The future they had both planned was on the edge of a precipice, and everything depended on the manager's next response. With a trembling voice but trying to maintain authority, Richard asked, "What were these changes?" The manager paused before responding, as if he knew that the revelation he was about to make would have a devastating impact. He took a deep breath and began to explain. The late Mrs. Madeleine directed the majority of her fortune to a philanthropic foundation she established in secret over the past few months. The foundation will focus on social causes that were very important to her, such as education and the protection of women's rights. Clara gasped, incredulous, while Richard felt the weight of the revelation settle heavily on his shoulders. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. Madeleine, whom he thought had been oblivious to everything in her final months, had silently made the decision that would ruin his plans. "And what about my share?" Richard asked, almost in a whisper. The manager looked at the documents one last time before responding firmly. "You will receive a small amount intended to cover your personal expenses, but the bulk of the fortune has been redirected to the foundation." The room seemed to spin around Richard. He could barely comprehend how everything had gone so wrong. All the plans he and Clara had made crumbled in that moment. Madeline, even in her last days, had managed to prevail. Clara, beside Richard, was pale. Her dreams of wealth and social ascension had been destroyed in seconds. She looked at Richard, waiting for some kind of reaction, but all she found was a broken man, unable to cope with the blow he had just received. As the manager handed Richard the papers to sign, confirming his acceptance of the new conditions, he knew his life would never be the same. He had lost not only Madeline's fortune, but also any chance to control his own destiny from that point forward. Leaving the bank, Richard and Clara barely exchanged words. The shock of the revelation still reverberated between them like a painful echo. The cold wind of Montreal whipped their faces, but neither of them seemed to feel the temperature. Clara, now aware that her plan for social ascension had been ruined, began to process the situation with a mix of anger and despair. Richard, on the other hand, walked in silence, feeling increasingly sunk in a sea of regret and helplessness. When they got into the car, the silence was unbearable. Clara stared at Richard, hoping he would say something that might in some way reverse the situation. But he simply stared blankly, his hands trembling on the steering wheel, unable to face the reality surrounding him. "And now?" Clara finally broke the silence, her voice cold and harsh. "What are we going to do now, Richard?" Richard, still not shifting his gaze, took a deep breath before responding, his voice hoarse with fatigue. "There's nothing more to be done. Madeline made her choices. She left everything to the foundation. What I received barely covers basic expenses." Clara let out a bitter, incredulous laugh. "You're saying we're left with nothing? After everything we've been through, after all our plans?" Richard finally looked at her, and the weight of his failure was visible in his eyes. "I didn't know, Clara. She did this without my knowledge, and now it's all over." Clara stared at him for a long moment, trying to find some spark of hope. But as the seconds passed, she realized there was no way forward. Her gaze shifted from frustration to pure rage. "So what are you saying? That all the time I spent with you was wasted? That I gave up everything, my freedom, my plans, my life, for nothing?" Richard tried to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He knew, in a way, that Clara was right. He had promised her a life of luxury, comfort, and power, and now he had nothing to offer. All he could offer at that moment was the harsh truth. "Clara, I don't know what to say. I thought everything was under control, but Madeline was always one step ahead of me." Clara looked at him with a mix of disdain and disappointment. Everything she had dreamed of with him, the trips, the luxurious house, the comfortable life away from society's judging eyes, now seemed like a cruel joke. And the person she blamed for that was standing right in front of her. "You're a failure, Richard," she spat, her voice laced with venom. "A pathetic failure." Those words hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. He knew Clara saw him merely as a means to achieve her own goals, but hearing it so directly was still devastating. He didn't try to defend himself or argue. He knew she was ready to leave. Clara, realizing there was nothing more to gain from staying with him, abruptly turned and opened the car door. Richard tried to call out to her, but his voice failed him. She left, slamming the door behind her, leaving Richard alone in the suffocating silence of the car. He watched her walk quickly down the sidewalk, disappearing into the crowd, while an overwhelming sense of loss consumed him. Clara had been more than just a lover. She had become his escape, his refuge from the life he had built with Madeleine. And now, he had lost both. For a brief moment, Richard considered going after Clara, trying to save her, but he knew it would be futile. Clara was not the type of woman who accepted defeat. She was already thinking about the next step, the next man who would lead her to the lifestyle she desired. And Richard now was merely an obstacle. He remained in the car for long minutes, the cold of Montreal seeping through the windows, as his mind processed the twists of the past few days. Madeleine was dead. Clara had abandoned him, and everything he thought he controlled had slipped through his fingers like sand. What was left? Looking out at the grey horizon of the city, Richard realized that, for the first time in many years, He was completely alone. There was no one left to turn to, no easy solution to fix the mess his life had become. He would have to face the consequences of his decisions, both those he made and those he ignored. As the wind howled outside, Richard felt a deep sense of emptiness. For the first time, he didn't know what to do. The days following his breakup with Clara were a haze of loneliness and regret for Richard. He took refuge in his home, where every room was filled with memories of Madeline, intensifying his sense of loss and failure. He barely ate, barely slept, just wandering through the empty mansion where the echo of his footsteps seemed to whisper of the wrong choices he had made. The weeks dragged on, and Richard finally realized he could no longer hide. He needed to fully understand what Madeline had done before she died, how she managed to alter the will without his knowledge. A part of him still clung to the hope that there might be some mistake, a legal loophole that would allow him to reclaim the inheritance. With this thought in mind, Richard decided to visit Madeleine's lawyer, a discreet and highly respected man in the legal field. He scheduled a meeting and soon found himself in the elegant office, where the paintings on the walls and the bookshelves filled with books conveyed a sense of power and knowledge. The lawyer, Mr. Beaumont, greeted him with slight formality and sat across from him opening a folder of documents. There was an impenetrable calm in his demeanor, as if he were accustomed to handling delicate and emotional situations. Richard, on the other hand, was tense, his hands sweaty as he awaited the explanation. "Mr. Beauchamp," the lawyer began, looking directly into Richard's eyes, "I understand you are here to gain a better understanding of the changes made to your wife's will." Richard nodded, his voice faltering as he tried to sound firm. "Yes, I need to understand what happened. Why did she do this? When was it decided?" Beaumont adjusted the papers in front of him before responding. "Mr. Beauchamp, Madeleine modified her will about a month before she passed away. She approached me with a clear mind and detailed instructions. I assure you there was no external interference or any type of pressure. She knew exactly what she was doing." Richard felt the ground crumble beneath him once again. The idea that Madeleine had done everything consciously was an even deeper blow. He had hoped she might have acted out of some mental confusion, but now that hope was fading. "But why?" he asked, almost in a whisper. "Did she hate me so much?" The lawyer watched him for a long moment before answering. "I don't believe it was a matter of hatred, Mr. Beauchamp. On the contrary, Madeleine told me she wanted her fortune to be used for something greater than just a life of luxury. She was deeply involved with social causes in the last months of her life, and this foundation was her way of leaving a legacy she considered meaningful." Richard leaned back in his chair, processing each word. Madeleine, the woman with whom he had shared so many years, had been involved with social causes. When did this happen? He had never noticed this side of her, or perhaps he had never paid enough attention. "What else did she say?" Richard asked, his voice now filled with genuine curiosity. Beaumont looked at him with a mix of understanding and professionalism. "She mentioned that in recent years she felt distant from you, Mr. Beauchamp, that your relationship had become something superficial based on appearances. She told me that although she still cared about you, she knew that the life you led no longer reflected who she was. That's why she decided to make these changes to her will." Richard was silent, Beaumont's words weighing heavily on him. Everything made sense now. The recent months of estrangement from Madeleine, the silence between them, the void he had been trying to fill with Clara. He had never stopped to truly look at Madeleine, to understand her changes and desires, and now it was too late. "Did she leave any message for me?" Richard asked hesitantly, almost fearful of the answer. Beaumont flipped through the papers for a moment before picking up a sealed letter. He handed it to Richard carefully, as if he knew that the message carried a deep emotional weight. Richard stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. His trembling hands tore the seal, and he pulled out the letter, reading the words written in Madeleine's firm handwriting. "Richard, if you are reading this, then you already know about my decisions. I'm sorry I didn't talk to you about this, but I knew you wouldn't understand at the time. The last few years have changed who I am, and I needed my life and my death to reflect these changes. You and I had our moments, both good and bad, and despite everything, I don't hate you. But you are no longer part of what I want for the future. Use what remains to rebuild yourself, to find yourself. I hope that somehow you can find peace. Goodbye, Madeline." The words seemed to echo in Richard's mind. "You are no longer part of what I want for the future." It was the end in every possible way. Madeline had excluded him from her life, from her future, even after death. Richard closed his eyes, holding the letter tightly. He had lost everything, not just the fortune, but also the chance for redemption with Madeline. She had moved on even before she passed away, while he remained trapped in a cycle of greed and superficiality. Beaumont, respecting the moment of silence, waited until Richard was ready to speak again. "And now?" Richard asked, his voice sounding defeated. "Now, Mr. Beauchamp, it's up to you to decide what to do with what remains." Richard knew the fortune was out of reach, but perhaps, just perhaps, there was something he could salvage, something within himself. He stood up from the chair, putting the letter in his coat pocket, and thanked Beaumont with a firm handshake. As he left the office, the cold Montreal breeze hit him again, but this time he felt it differently. For the first time in weeks, Richard realized he needed to face his life head-on. There was no more Clara, no more Madeline, just him, with his mistakes and the possibility of someday rebuilding something new. The days following the meeting with the lawyer were silent, but strangely clarifying for Richard. He began to accept that the life he had planned with Clara and the financial security provided by Madeline had vanished. More than ever, he needed to face the consequences of his choices. However, a part of his past still haunted him, the distant relationship with his daughter Sophie. Since the funeral, Sophie had remained distant, avoiding any significant contact with Richard. This was nothing new. The relationship between father and daughter had always been marked by silence, misunderstandings, and a distance that seemed impossible to overcome. Sophie had never fully accepted her parents' marriage, especially after Richard's betrayals became a poorly kept secret. Now more than ever, Richard felt the need to correct, or at least try to rebuild, what remained of his relationship with his daughter. He knew that Sophie, being his only blood family, represented the last. If he wanted to find some form of redemption, he needed to start with her. Richard hesitated for several days before finally picking up the phone and calling Sophie. The phone rang several times before going to voicemail. He tried again and again, until finally Sophie answered. "Dad?" Her voice on the other end was distant and cold, but there was a hint of curiosity in her question. Richard knew Sophie wasn't expecting to hear from him. "Sophie," he began, his voice slightly trembling. "We need to talk, please. I know things between us have never been easy, but I'd like to at least try to make things right. Can we meet?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Richard could almost hear Sophie's thoughts swirling, weighing whether to accept or not. He held his breath, waiting for her response. "All right," she finally replied, with little emotion. "But that doesn't mean I'm going to forgive you." "I know," Richard said, a slight relief washing over him. "I just want a chance to explain." They arranged to meet at a small cafe in downtown Montreal. It was a neutral location, away from the house where Richard and Madeline had lived and which carried so many memories. Richard arrived early, anxious and restless, watching the street scene through the cafe's large windows. When Sophie finally appeared, he barely recognized her at first. Sophie, now 27, looked like a completely independent woman. Her long brown hair was pulled up in a bun, and her face expressed a mix of fatigue and coldness. She wore a heavy coat to shield herself from the cold, and seeing her made Richard realize how many important moments of her life he had missed. He barely knew the woman sitting across from him now. "Hi, Sophie," he said, trying to sound warm. She gave a slight nod, but her expression remained impassive. "You said you wanted to talk, so here I am." Richard took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. He didn't know where to start, so he decided to be as honest as possible. "I know I've made many mistakes. I know our relationship was never good, and part of that is my fault, but I wanted to see you, at least try to explain what happened." "With your mother, with all of this?" Sophie crossed her arms, watching him intently. "Do you think this will change anything? What happened is in the past. You betrayed Mom for years, Richard. I know everything. And now you come here, expecting what? That I'll just forgive and forget? Richard felt the impact of her words, but he knew he couldn't give up so easily. "I'm not expecting you to forgive me, Sophie. I just want you to understand. I've lost everything. Your mother knew more than I imagined. She knew about my mistakes and decided, despite everything, to go through with her plan. There's nothing left for me, and honestly, I don't know if I deserve anything." Sophie looked at him with narrowed eyes, trying to gauge the sincerity of his words. "And what does that have to do with me?" Richard hesitated, feeling the weight of what he was about to say. "I just wanted a chance to redeem myself, to show you that despite everything, I'm still your father, and that I care about you." Sophie let out a bitter laugh, disbelieving. "Care? Dad, you never cared about me. I was just a background figure in your life, a pawn you ignored while you followed your own plans. What's changed now?" Richard shrank, but he knew she was right. Sophie had been neglected by him, a constant presence but often invisible in his life. He had never given her the attention she deserved. "I know, Sophie. I know I was wrong. But now all I have left is to try to fix what I can. I've lost your mother, I've lost Clara, and now I'm on the brink of losing you too. I just wanted a chance to start over." The silence that followed was heavy, and Sophie seemed to be weighing her options. She uncrossed her arms, looking at the coffee in her hands, and finally responded, "I don't know if we can start over. I think it's too late for that, but maybe we can at least try." Richard felt a small spark of hope ignite within him. "That's all I'm asking, Sophie, a chance. We can start slow." Sophie looked at him for one more moment before finally nodding slightly. "All right, Dad, we can try." Those simple words were all Richard needed to hear. Although he knew there was still a long way to go, that small opening was a step in the right direction. He knew that past wounds wouldn't heal overnight, but for the first time in a long time, he felt there was a possibility for redemption. Despite the tentative reconciliation with Sophie, Richard still felt adrift. Without Madeleine, Clara, or the security of his former life, he faced an existence without the guarantees he had once considered unshakable. Days passed in a routine, lackluster manner, and the mansion where he lived seemed like an empty monument to his failures. On a cold, grey morning, Richard received an unexpected call from the bank. The manager's voice sounded urgent, but with a strange politeness that piqued his curiosity. Without giving many details, the manager requested that Richard come to the bank as soon as possible to discuss a matter of extreme importance. Intrigued, Richard put on his heavy coat and headed to the bank. The cold Montreal wind cut across his face as he walked through the streets, lost in thoughts about what could have happened. He knew he had already lost access to Madeleine's inheritance, so he couldn't imagine what awaited him this time. Upon arriving at the bank, he was led directly to the manager's office, a serious, middle-aged man named Jean-Philippe. Upon entering, Richard noticed another person in the room, a lawyer with an impassive demeanor. Something was happening, and the tension in the air was palpable. "Mr. Beauchamp, thank you for coming so promptly," Jean-Philippe began, gesturing for Richard to sit down. "I'm sorry to bring you such abrupt news, but we have discovered a situation that needs to be resolved immediately." Richard frowned, trying to grasp the gravity of the situation. "What kind of situation?" he asked, his voice laden. The manager exchanged a brief glance with the lawyer before responding. "This concerns an investigation involving your late wife's foundation. We discovered a large sum of money that was not allocated to the charity as indicated in the will." Richard was stunned. "What do you mean? Madeleine made it clear that all the money should go to the foundation. What happened?" The lawyer intervened. "It appears that before her death, your wife created a second bank account, completely separate from the foundation and her usual personal accounts. This account contains a significant sum that was not included in the original estate proceedings." Richard struggled to process the information, his mind racing in circles. But why would she do that? Why hide this sum? The manager and the lawyer exchanged glances again before Jean-Philippe continued. "We don't yet know the exact reasons, Mr. Boak, but what we do know is that this account was created in secrecy and that the money appears to be tied to a project that Madeleine was conducting on her own. This project was registered in her name, but until now, no one knew of its existence." Richard felt a shiver run down his spine. What was Madeleine planning that he didn't know about? Was it some form of revenge, or was it something far greater than he could ever imagine? "And what happens now?" Richard asked, trying to stay calm. The lawyer looked at him, carefully measuring his words. "That depends on how you wish to proceed. Legally, you still have a right to part of this sum, since you were married to Mrs. Madeleine at the time of her death. However, this matter could also become public, and that could complicate the reputation of the foundation your wife created." Richard fell silent, considering his options. He still had a chance to recover some of the fortune he thought he had lost forever. But at the same time, the idea of tarnishing Madeleine's legacy and the foundation she valued so much made him hesitate. He knew that whatever choice he made would have deep consequences. The silence in the room lingered as Richard pondered, until he finally stood up from his chair, his mind already made up. "I won't contest the inheritance," he said, his voice firm. "Madeleine did what she did for a reason. I've lost everything that was important. I won't tarnish her name or the foundation. You can allocate the money as she would have wanted." The lawyer and the manager looked at him with expressions of surprise and respect. They hadn't expected this stance from Richard, especially after everything he had been through. Jean-Philippe stood up, extending his hand to Richard. "We respect your decision, Mr. Beauchamp. We will ensure that your wife's wishes are fulfilled in the most discreet manner possible." Richard shook his hand, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in a long time, he had done something that felt right, something that honored Madeleine's spirit, instead of acting solely out of... As he left the bank, the cold Montreal breeze enveloped him again, but now it felt almost comforting. He no longer had the wealth he had once planned for himself, but somehow he felt lighter. There was something in accepting his new reality that brought him a peace he hadn't felt in years. Back at his house, Richard found a message from Sophie. She had left a simple but direct note. "We can have dinner together this week. Let me know when you're available." It was a small victory, but to Richard, it felt like the beginning of something new. He knew that reconciling with Sophie wouldn't be easy, and that his path ahead would still be filled with challenges, but for the first time he was willing to face those challenges head-on. That night, as Richard sat alone in the living room, he looked at Madeleine's letter one last time. He reread her words, and this time, instead of feeling the pain and loss that had initially consumed him, he felt a strange sense of gratitude. Madeleine had freed him from a life he perhaps should never have chosen, and now, with the end of this painful chapter, Richard finally felt that he could start writing a new one, a chapter where the choices he made would be his own, without the shadow of greed or regret. Winter in Montreal was beginning to show signs of spring. The streets were starting to be filled with small flowers defying the cold, and Richard noticed the changes around him with a new kind of perception. After his recent decisions, he felt that, in a way, he was beginning to emerge from the shadows of his own life. The night of the dinner with Sophie arrived quickly. Richard was nervous, not only about the opportunity to reconnect with his daughter, but also about the possibility that this night could be a new starting point for both of them. He had made an effort to prepare a simple yet elegant dinner, reflecting his desire to create a comfortable and welcoming environment. When Sophie arrived, Richard greeted her at the door with a genuine smile, something he hadn't easily displayed in a long time. Sophie looked more relaxed than in their previous meetings, dressed casually yet elegantly. She brought with her a bottle of wine, a gesture that, although simple, made Richard feel that there was a real openness to a new beginning. "Hi, Dad," she said, handing over the bottle. "I hope this is acceptable." Richard smiled and accepted the bottle, feeling relieved as he realized the atmosphere was beginning to feel more natural. "It's perfect. Come in. Let's sit down. Dinner is almost ready." Sophie went to the table, where the setting was simple but welcoming. The soft lighting and classical music in the background helped create a calm atmosphere. Richard noticed that Sophie was observing the details with a subtle interest, which he took as a positive sign. As Richard served dinner, they talked about trivial matters, trying to avoid emotionally charged topics. Richard discovered that Sophie was involved in an environmental research project at university, something that made her GLE. It was a facet of his daughter he had never known so deeply. "That sounds amazing, Sophie," Richard commented, genuinely impressed. "I didn't know you had this interest." She smiled, a look of satisfaction and pride on her face. Yes, it's something I'm really passionate about. I've learned a lot and hope we can make a real difference. The dinner proceeded with a conversation that flowed more smoothly than Richard had expected. Sophie seemed relaxed, and the exchanges between father and daughter were less tense than in their previous meetings. They discussed the impact of climate change, the challenges of university life, and even some personal topics, like childhood memories. After dinner, while Richard and Sophie were in the living room, the conversation began to turn towards more personal matters. Richard felt that the opportunity to touch on deeper topics had arrived. "Sophie, I really want you to know how sorry I am for everything that happened between us," Richard began, his voice a bit hesitant. "I know I failed as a father and as a husband, and that these failures affected our family in ways I never fully understood." Sophie looked at him with an expression that mixed caution and understanding. "I appreciate your words, Dad, but what matters now is what we do from here. I don't want to live in the past, and I know you don't want to either." Richard nodded, feeling a sense of relief. "Yes, I agree. I want us to start building something new. I don't know what the future holds, but I'm willing to do my best to be a better father and be present for you." Sophie smiled softly, and Richard noticed a slight change in her gaze. Maybe, just maybe, there was a real possibility of rebuilding the relationship they had lost. "That means a lot to me, Dad," Sophie said. "I know the path won't be easy, but I'm willing to try too." They hugged, a simple gesture but full of meaning. Richard felt that he had taken a significant step towards a new phase in his life. Although the path ahead was still uncertain, he felt more prepared to face it with a new perspective. In the following days, Richard continued to adjust to his new reality. He became more actively involved with the foundation that Madeleine had created, helping to ensure that her legacy was honored in the way she had intended. The work was challenging but also rewarding, and Richard felt that he was contributing to something greater than himself. He also made a conscious effort to reconnect with Sophie, spending more time with her and supporting her projects. Although he could not erase the past, he was determined to create a future where they could have a healthy and meaningful relationship. Spring arrived in Montreal, bringing with it a revival of colors and life. Richard observed the changes around him with a renewed sense of hope. He knew there was still much to be done to repair the damage of the past, but he was ready to face the challenges with a new perspective and a more open heart. As he walked through the city streets, Richard reflected on the lessons he had learned. He realized that the true value of life was not in material wealth, but in the relationships we build and the way we choose to live. And by facing his future with a more humble and conscious attitude, he found a form of peace that had previously seemed out of reach. Ultimately, Richard understood that life was a journey filled with ups and downs, and that the true measure of success was the ability to learn from mistakes and continue to seek truth and connection with those we love. And so, with the arrival of spring, Richard felt that he was finally ready to write the next chapter of his life. If this story touched your heart and you want to keep experiencing more inspiring and emotional tales, don't miss our upcoming videos. Subscribe to our channel now and turn on notifications to stay updated with new content that can brighten your journey and offer valuable perspectives. Join us and continue exploring stories that make a difference. I'm sure the next video that appears on your screen will touch you as well, so click on it now and I'll see you there.